Picture the scene. The echo of a scream pierces the stone corridors of Bletsoe Castle on a freezing winter night in 1457. Outside, snow falls silently on the hardened earth of Bedfordshire, but within those walls, the calm is shattered by the agonizing sound of a young girl forced to become a mother far too soon. In the flickering light of a few candles, the fragile body of Lady Margaret Beaufort, only 13 years old, writhes in unbearable pain. Her small hands desperately grip the blood-stained sheets, while the midwives murmur prayers in Latin, fearing that death will take both mother and child. It was not a fully grown, mature woman lying in that bed, but a child whose body was still developing. And yet destiny demanded that she bring into the world a son destined to change the history of England. Every contraction seemed to break her. Every wave of suffering brought her closer to the abyss. "She is too young," the midwives whispered, aware that nature was being pushed beyond its limits. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the smoke of herbs burned to ease the pain, but neither medicine nor prayers seemed enough. In that moment, no one was thinking of greatness, dynasties, or thrones. Everything came down to a desperate struggle to survive an endless night. However, the irony of fate loomed over everyone present. From that suffering would be born a child who would put an end to the bloodiest war England had ever known, and who would found the powerful Tudor dynasty. What few understood then was that this young girl, broken in body but not in spirit, was destined to become one of the most decisive female figures in medieval history. The tragedy that marked her childhood would, at the same time, be the seed of a legacy that would transform entire kingdoms. Lady Margaret Beaufort was born in May 1443 into a family marked by greatness and tragedy. Her lineage was not just any lineage. The blood of kings ran through her veins as she was descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III of England. From birth, Margaret was aware, though too young to fully understand it, that this heritage could be both a gift and a curse. Her father, John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, had been a commander in the service of England during the final phase of the Hundred Years' War. In France, he witnessed the hard-won victories of Henry V crumble one by one, and with each defeat, his spirit withered away. Years later, upon returning to England in 1444, courtiers described him as a defeated man, sunken eyes, trembling hands, and empty stare. Barely a year later, he was found dead in his chambers. The official version cited a fever, but rumors spread quickly. Some said he had taken his own life, unable to bear the weight of disgrace. Others whispered of poison and betrayal. The truth is that Margaret was left fatherless when she was barely a year old. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, immediately understood the fragility of the situation. In an England where power was woven through alliances and marriages, the widow knew that her daughter's survival depended on securing her future as soon as possible. Thus, when Margaret was still a child, she was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the influential Duke of Suffolk. The engagement seemed like a perfect move. Two powerful families united, a secure future. But medieval politics were unstable, shifting like sand beneath one's feet. In 1450, the Duke of Suffolk fell from grace after negotiating an unpopular peace with France, and while attempting to flee to the continent, he was captured and brutally murdered in the English Channel. With clumsy blows from a rusty sword, he lost his life, and with him crumbled the promises of his son's future, and Margaret's. Overnight, that betrothal, solemnly written and sealed with family crests, was worth no more than a torn piece of parchment. It was then that young Margaret learned the first lesson that would shape her entire life. In the world of the nobility, fate could turn in an instant, and survival depended on the ability to adapt. Her royal blood made her a treasure to some and a threat to others, and this double-edged sword would accompany her every step of the way. Margaret's destiny took another turn in 1455. She was barely 12 years old when she was given in marriage to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The union was celebrated in the same Bletsoe Castle where she had spent her childhood, beneath tapestries recounting the glories of her Beaufort ancestors and in front of her grandfather's tomb, as if history itself wanted to remind her of the weight of the blood she carried. Edmund was a man hardened by war and politics in his early 20s. He had grown up at court, knew power and intrigue, and was prepared to use that marriage as just another political instrument. Margaret, on the other hand, was barely leaving childhood games behind, with a body still growing and an innocent soul that could not grasp the true dimensions of the vows she was taking. At that time, the concept of waiting for physical maturity to consummate a marriage did not exist. A noble girl was considered nothing more than a vessel for alliances and heirs. The wedding night marked Margaret indelibly, a silenced trauma that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She never spoke of what happened within those walls, but her obsessive religious devotion and permanent physical scars left an unerasable trace. Shortly after, her body began to show signs of pregnancy. The astonishment of those around her was mixed with obvious concern. How could a 13-year-old girl endure a childbirth that put even adult women at risk? Her own mother, who had given birth at an older age and with fewer dangers, watched with anguish as little Margaret prepared to face an ordeal that nature itself seemed to reject. As if fate wanted to deal another blow, Edmund Tudor would not live to see his son born. In 1456, amidst the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, he was captured in Wales and died under suspicious circumstances. Some said he fell ill in prison, others that he was murdered to weaken the Lancastrian cause. Thus, Margaret was left a widow at 13, pregnant and alone, trapped in a world of men and wars that did not forgive weakness. Following Edmund's death, the young widow was placed under the protection of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. He understood that this girl was not just a defenseless relative. She carried in her womb the potential heir to the Lancastrian cause. To shield her from the chaos of war, he took her to Pembroke Castle on the coast of Wales, a place as imposing as it was inhospitable. The journey was an odyssey. It was the dead of winter. The roads were covered in frozen mud and fallen trees, and Margaret, her body weakened by pregnancy, endured every jolt of the carriage as if it were a stab wound. What should have been a 2-day trip dragged on for 5, amidst forced detours, overflowing rivers, and the constant fear of being intercepted by armed men whose loyalties were uncertain. Pembroke Castle, built on a rocky promontory, seemed to defy the Atlantic Ocean that relentlessly battered the cliffs. Its massive cold walls offered security against enemies, but no comfort. The wind slipped through every crack in the stone. Ice formed even on the inside of the windows, and the hearths devoured firewood without managing to warm the frigid air. There, surrounded by icy drafts and shadows, Margaret awaited the most dangerous moment of her short life. The doctors and midwives attending her were alarmed. Her pelvis was too narrow, the child too large. They spoke in whispers of procedures that almost always ended in the mother's death. Jasper Tudor listened to those conversations with a heavy heart. If she died, the hope of his lineage died with her. Finally, in January 1457, the contractions began. Margaret doubled over in pain as she walked along the ramparts, just as the doctor had recommended to strengthen her body. The labor lasted for nearly 18 endless hours, during which her agonizing screams echoed throughout the castle, until her voice broke and was reduced to ragged moans. The smoke of medicinal herbs filled the room. The midwives prayed softly, and every minute seemed to bring tragedy closer. The head midwife, Dame Gwen, with decades of experience, knew that both their lives hung by a thread. With steady hands and the help of other women, she finally managed to guide the child into the world. The silence of a few seconds became unbearable until a weak yet clear cry pierced the air. Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII of England, was born. Margaret, exhausted and barely conscious, managed to feel the warmth of her son on her chest before he was taken away to be cleaned. She had survived, but at a devastating cost. Her body was permanently damaged. The internal tearing was so severe that doctors assured she would never be able to have more children. At 13, after a single, brutal childbirth, she had been left sterile. Her recovery was slow and painful. Fevers, infections, and night terrors tormented her for weeks. The experience left her with indelible physical scars and a deep fear of human contact. But what could not be broken was her spirit. That young girl, marked by suffering, was beginning to be forged in the cold iron of adversity. Margaret's survival after childbirth was seen almost as a miracle. But in 15th century England, surviving was not enough. One had to find a way to stay safe in a world dominated by shifting alliances and bloody wars. Barely recovered, with a scarred body and a wounded soul, she was led into a new marriage, this time to Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. There was no room for personal choice. The union was a political refuge, a practical solution to protect her lands and secure her son's position. The wedding was simple, without the pomp or solemnity that had accompanied her union with Edmund Tudor. Margaret was still weak, more concerned for the safety of her little Henry than for a husband who was almost a stranger to her. Stafford, pragmatic and with Yorkist leanings, soon understood that the key to the marriage was not love, but political balance. For him, it meant access to the Beaufort estates. For her, it meant protection in a kingdom bleeding itself dry between white and red roses. During those years, Margaret began to demonstrate the strategic intelligence that would characterize her for life. She learned to manage vast estates, meticulously read financial records, and understand the complex web of feudal duties. But she did not limit herself to the domestic sphere. She knew how to weave relationships with influential ladies on both sides, building bridges where men saw only enemies. She maintained correspondence with Queen Elizabeth Woodville, wife of Edward IV, while simultaneously sending secret messages to Margaret of Anjou, exiled in France. This dual loyalty, dangerous and risky, made her a master of silent diplomacy. The personal cost, however, was painful. Her son Henry remained under the guardianship of his uncle Jasper in Wales, protected from the political fluctuations of London. Margaret only saw him once or twice a year, and always under strict conditions. The separation was a torment, but she understood that distance meant survival. In every ciphered letter, in every small gift sent to Wales, she tried to keep alive the connection with that child who carried the hope of an entire cause in his blood. To cope with the anguish, Margaret took refuge in an intense, almost obsessive religiosity. She spent hours on her knees in the chapel, reciting prayers until she bled, convinced that physical suffering could bring her closer to God. Some historians have seen this excessive devotion as a response to trauma, an attempt to make sense of a pain that would otherwise be unbearable. But beyond the spiritual, that faith transformed into discipline, inner strength, and the certainty that her life had a higher purpose, to pave the way so that her son one day would reach the throne of England. The relative calm that Margaret had managed to build in her life was, in reality, a fragile illusion. England was burning in civil war. The white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster clashed in a brutal conflict that destroyed families, fields, and entire realms. The Battle of St. Albans in 1455 was just the beginning of a whirlwind of blood that intensified with the massacre of Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, where tens of thousands of men met their death beneath the red-stained snow. With each defeat, the Lancastrian cause seemed to crumble. King Henry II, unstable and weak, retreated into madness, while his wife, Margaret of Anjou, fought fiercely to keep the hope of their lineage alive. But the Yorkist forces, led by Edward IV, grew unstoppable. The ultimate defeat came in 1471 at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The young Prince Edward of Westminster, the only direct heir of Henry VI, fell dead in combat. Shortly after, Henry VI himself disappeared in the Tower of London, likely murdered in silence. With the deaths of father and son, the direct line of the Lancasters was extinguished. It was then that the figure of Margaret and, above all, that of her son Henry Tudor, acquired an unexpected weight. In the eyes of many, that shy boy growing up in Wales became the last ray of hope for the defeated, but also a dangerous target. Jasper Tudor understood that keeping young Henry in England amounted to a death sentence. In September 1471, at barely 14 years old, he was put on a ship at night in a Welsh port, bound for exile in Brittany. It was the only way to save him from the fury of the Yorkists. The farewell was silent and desperate. Margaret, far from her son, received the news days later. Henry had left his homeland, and there was no certainty that he would ever return. For her, it was like losing him a second time. For the next 14 years, she would live separated from her son by seas and borders, depending on coded letters, merchants' rumors, and news brought by travelers just to know if he was still alive. Every day was an agonizing wait, a knife's edge between hope and fear. In the midst of that personal void, Margaret transformed. She understood that if she wanted to protect her son's future, she had to become more than just a mother. She had to be a strategist, a politician, and a weaver of alliances. That is why she accepted a third marriage, this time to Thomas Stanley, one of the most astute nobles in England. There was no love in that union, but there was convenience. Stanley was a master at switching sides at the opportune moment and possessed the military power that Margaret needed. For her, it meant protection. For him, prestige and the influence of the Beaufort blood. Thus, amidst intrigues, prayers, and pacts, Margaret began to forge herself into one of the most powerful female figures of her time, preparing for the day when her son could return from exile and reclaim what the war had taken from him. The England that Margaret inhabited in the 1480s was a minefield of suspicion and betrayal. The sudden death of Edward IV in 1483 opened a power vacuum that altered the entire political balance. His son, the young Edward V, barely a 12-year-old boy, was to take the throne. But his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, moved with relentless speed. He took his nephews under his protection and locked them in the Tower of London. Shortly after, the boys disappeared forever, shrouded in one of the darkest mysteries in English history. Richard was crowned as Richard III, but from the very beginning, his reign was stained by the suspicion of infanticide. For Margaret, that tragedy became a unique opportunity. For the first time in decades, Yorkist legitimacy was faltering, and the name of her son, Henry Tudor, though distant and debatable, began to sound like a viable alternative. With almost reckless audacity, Margaret threw herself into conspiring. Through Bishop John Morton and a network of Lancastrian exiles, she hatched plans for an uprising that would unite former enemies against the usurper. Her goal was not only to dethrone Richard, but to crown her son as King of England. The preparations were complex. They required money, ships, troops, and above all, coordination between Brittany and England. Coded letters, messages hidden between lines of commerce, promises made in secret. Every move put Margaret on the brink of open treason, and indeed, in October 1483, the rebellion broke out. Henry was supposed to land with an army in Devon, while in England, the conspirators raised their banners against Richard. But fate was cruel. A storm scattered Henry's fleet, the rebellion crumbled, and Richard reacted with ferocity. The ringleaders were executed, and Margaret, discovered at the heart of the plot, seemed doomed. Only her marriage to Thomas Stanley, a man too useful for Richard to lose, saved her life. Stanley interceded, and the capital punishment was commuted to house arrest and the confiscation of her lands. Many would have given up at that point, but not Margaret. From her confinement, she continued to conspire with the same cold patience she had cultivated all her life. Even more refined codes, loyal servants carrying messages, secret contacts with foreign ambassadors. It was all part of a silent network that never broke. While Richard reigned, she prepared the ground for her son's return. Because Margaret knew it, every failure was just a rehearsal, every defeat one more step toward final victory. The board was stained with blood, but there was still one move left to make, and she was willing to bet everything on the triumph of Henry Tudor. August 1485, after years of exile, uncertainty, and conspiracies, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a modest but determined army. The moment of truth had arrived. On August 22nd, on the fields of Bosworth, the battle that would decide the fate of England was fought. Richard III, the usurper, fought fiercely until the very last moment. But at the decisive instant, the forces of Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, switched sides and joined Henry. It was the master stroke she had patiently cultivated for years. Richard fell in the mud, dead, and with him, the legitimacy of the Yorks was extinguished. Henry was proclaimed king as Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret, who had endured the pain of a broken childhood, the loss of her innocence, the exile of her son, and decades of intrigue, became the most powerful woman in England. She was the king's mother, a title that granted her unprecedented influence in a realm newly born from war. However, her relationship with Henry was never that of an ordinary mother. That child she had given birth to amidst screams and blood in Pembroke no longer existed. He had transformed into a distant king, shaped by exile and politics. Margaret had protected him, conspired, and sacrificed everything for him. But the price was the renunciation of full motherhood. Mother and king were united by an indestructible bond, though marked by absence and duty. The following years confirmed the magnitude of her legacy. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two warring houses and putting an end to the Wars of the Roses. The new dynasty brought stability to a torn realm, and Margaret played a fundamental role in the foundations of that power. She managed lands, founded religious and educational institutions, and left her mark as a woman of fierce intelligence in a male-dominated world. She died in 1509, just days after seeing her grandson, Henry VIII, crowned. With her past a life marked by tragedy, but also by unwavering determination. That 13-year-old girl who had screamed in pain in a freezing room in Pembroke had transformed her suffering into power, her motherhood into a dynasty, and her faith into an eternal legacy. Today, her tomb in Westminster Abbey rests in silence, with inscriptions that exalt her piety and greatness. But what cannot be heard in the stone is the echo of that distant scream, the voice of a girl forced to become a woman too soon, who with her sacrifice forever changed the course of English history.